All right, thank you everybody for joining. Good afternoon. Today's webinar is called Detecting the Undetectable Linux Rootkits. My name is Eric. I'll be emceeing today and handling Q&A. We've got a great agenda today. So first, Jace is going to show you, Jace, you want to go to the next slide? Yeah, so first, Jace is going to show you how to detect two common Linux rootkits, LD preload and loadable kernel modules, or LKM. Then next, he's going to walk through three examples: Symbiote, Orbit, and Syslogic. After that, he's going to talk about ways to remove the rootkits once you found them. And then after that, I'm going to come back on and provide a brief overview of our threat hunting service and explain how we engage with our clients and what outcomes you would expect to receive from the service if you choose to work with us. And finally, we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. And to ask questions, you can just click the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type your questions there. Please feel free to ask questions as soon as you think of them. You don't need to wait till the end. If we see questions that are relevant throughout the presentation, we'll try to answer them on that slide. And anything we don't answer throughout, we'll answer at the end. So whenever a question comes to your mind, please ask away. We want this to be as engaging and informative as possible. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jace to introduce himself and get started.
Hey, do you see me okay?
Yep, I can see you and hear you. Thanks, Jace.
Cool, so let's get started. So this is just a little bit about me. My name is Jace Walker. I'm a threat hunter at Binary Defense, and I come from a background of Linux system administration, and then kind of converted over to doing security related to Linux, and got to where I am now. Proud father to my corgi Pax. He's in the other room right now because he can't be trusted while I'm on the call. So the reason I started a lot of this research, and a lot of it came naturally, was because the amount of Linux malware samples that have been coming out this year and the end of last year it's been a sharp increase. As you can see, in the first half of 2021, it's a considerably less amount than in quarter two, or in the first half of 2022. And so that just kind of naturally led me to, discovering some of these samples as the news came out and analyzing them. So the two types we're going to talk about today are first LD preload type rootkits. So these operate off of shared objects, and shared objects are like libraries that you can use in your code in order to, keep your code base thin. You don't have to rewrite a bunch of functions that already exist, kind of like importing a library in Python, for example. And so LD preload rootkits aim to kind of abuse this process. So they kind of insert themselves in between a program and the library that it wants to talk to. And it can even be installed in the user land through environment variables. It doesn't even have to, necessarily need root. It's pretty unusual in most production environments. This kind of thing is usually used for debugging or developing new software if you need it to behave differently in a development environment, for example. And it is easier to detect than LKM rootkits, which is the next type that we're going to talk about here. So LKM, or loadable kernel module rootkits, they are their own file format, relocatable ELF files, and they operate at the kernel level. They can be inserted directly into the running kernel, which is a huge benefit for anyone that may want to abuse them, as well as legitimate uses. So all you have to do is just insert the mod and it'll start going. And because of that, it's a lot harder to detect than LD preload rootkits, because it is running at the root level and it basically has control of all of the functions that you might want to access. So first, we'll go off with LD preload in some ways that you could possibly detect it. So it can be set in environment variables. When it is set this way, it's restricted and it can't intercept calls from setuid binaries. So a lot of the important binaries set this way because this is the userland way of setting it. Unfortunately for them, it will not intercept things like changing your password or becoming root and things like that. And there's a couple of different places that you can set environment variables. You can export it into the current shell. You can set Etsy environment, a lot of different bash RC files. This is a very like small list, but there's a lot of places where you can set environment variables. The next place is Etsy ld.so.preload. So this is unrestricted because it does require root in order to set. And it is a persistent configuration file. It'll persist through reboots, and it points to a shared object, the malicious shared object that an attacker might install. And when it's set this way, any process that starts afterwards will start with that shared object being inserted. And then we can take a look in the /proc file system. It's a virtual file system. It doesn't contain real files or anything. It's just a representation of what's going on with your runtime kernel and system information. So you can see some things about memory and devices that are mounted, information about processes, any environment variables, or what executable was used to launch a process. So yeah, you can look in proc pid environ, and it shows environment variables that were used to launch the process. But unfortunately, if it's set with the Etsy file, it's not technically an environment variable, so it won't show up there. And then there's a tool called LDD, and it will check the shared objects that are required by a command that you want to use. So for example, LDD bin bash, and that will show you something like this. If there was an evil shared object installed, that is. But you can see all these different libraries that would need to be loaded by bash. So now we'll just cover a couple ways that you could possibly detect kernel modules. So you can compare the file proc call syms. It has all of the symbols of dynamically loaded modules as well as static system symbols. So basically the addresses in memory of where all the functions are. So you can compare a system that you might suspect has a rootkit to a known good one that's similar and see what differences there are, if any. You can compare the directory sysmodule. It's another place where you can find information about the kernel. So the entire sys directory is a lot like proc. It's like a virtual file system. It lets you interface and look at things about the kernel that's currently running in a file system-like way. And then you can look in proc pid exe for the executable used to launch a process, and you can look in places that would be suspicious for a process to launch from, like Etsy or temp or vartemp. And system instability is a big indicator, or it can be a big indicator of kernel modules as well, because oftentimes the work isn't, extensive in development and testing and making sure that those functions aren't, called by anything system critical. So system crashes can be an indicator of that sort of thing. And if you have like one problem device among a bunch of devices that are similar or identical, you can think of rootkits as a possible way that it's causing your its system instability. And then finally, memory analysis, of course. It's the most effective way of finding the kernel module because it does get loaded into memory. And so here's a couple of volatility plugins that can be useful for finding those sorts of things, looking at syscalls, modules, anything placed in line with the kernel. You can dump out modules and find hidden modules. And so there's a couple of tools out there for hunting rootkits that are pretty useful. So the first two are RK-Hunter and Check Rootkit. So they were both started quite a while ago, and they don't get updated super frequently. And usually when they do, it's with signatures of specific rootkits rather than more general behavior. There's Sandfly, which is free up to 500 endpoints. It's agentless, and it's not inhibited by LD preload rootkits because it uses some statically linked binaries in order to accomplish some of the work that it does. So it just SSHs into machines and gathers data and then exits, and it can see a lot of a lot of infrastructure that you can protect with that. They have a standalone tool as well called Sandfly Process Decloak, and it's very good, written in Go, and it will attempt to find hidden processes, and it's really fast being written in Go. And then BusyBox Static. BusyBox Static is like a collection of Linux tools that you might be using on a day-to-day basis, like cat or stat, ls, grep. And because it's statically linked, it is not affected by LD preload libraries. It doesn't have to use those dynamically linked libraries at all. It has everything it needs all in one place. So the first case we're going to talk about here is Symbiote, which was discovered earlier this year. It's an LD preload based rootkit. It was discovered by Intezer and BlackBerry and has a couple of typical rootkit features: process, file, network hiding. So let's give LDD a shot. We want to go for like the low-hanging fruit first. So we take a look here. We don't see anything necessarily out of the ordinary. If you're not familiar with Linux systems, sometimes this part can be a little bit difficult, but they're pretty simple to, look up and find their function and determine if it makes sense on your system. So our first clue here is we're going to take a look at our environment files for all of the processes. So we can look for any environment variable set up in current processes. So we can grep LD preload in the environment file of every PID. And in this case, we can see that that is loaded into multiple different processes. And like I said before, it's pretty uncommon in most production environments. So this will give you a pretty quick idea of something that might be going on, and it gives you the information of what shared object is being loaded. But it's important to note that this kind of information won't appear if LD preload is set with the etc file instead. So this can be missed if it's set in that way. So if we did find it that way, we can try to take a look at it. So if we try to ls that directory and grep for it, it doesn't appear. So that's a standard, rootkit thing, hiding files that are related to itself. But in this case, querying the file directly actually works. So it doesn't show up in the directory, but you can still manipulate it. And so that's pretty suspicious on most systems. In that case, you could see that it was called search.so. You could do some research on that, and you'd pretty quickly come by the research done by Intezer and BlackBerry on Symbiote. And they have a list of files that they observe that it hides. So you can do just like a quick for loop in bash to loop through all of those files and create them in a directory. And then you can list that directory and see how many are still there. So if you see 20, then maybe it's not that rootkit, or maybe it's a different variant that doesn't use any of those files. But in this case, we can see that 6 files of the 20 that we just created are now hidden. So now we want to check for process hiding. We know something's going on here. This is a Python script that I wrote up. It's not super fast. This would definitely be better accomplished by some sort of compiled binary. And essentially, it's going to look, if you can see on line 21 of that code there, I'm not sure how visible it is, but there's a file in proc sys kernel pidmax, and that will show you how many PIDs can be on a system. And that is what we're going to use to basically brute force the entire range of process IDs. So what we do is get a list of all the process IDs that the system says that there are, and then we want to query every possible one directly. And if we if we can find a proc that didn't exist in that first listing, but can be queried directly, then that could be an indicator of that being hidden, being intentionally hidden from us. And so we run the script. It's going to go through all of them, and it finds 58016. And so this process ID is one that didn't show up in the listing of all processes, but could be queried directly. And so we can take a look in that process with ls-l. We see the executable that it was started with. So we want to take a look. User local bin, not an unusual place for binaries to be. And certbot, of course, we all know, very useful tool. And so that's not suspicious on its own. So what we can do is let's go ahead and try to see if we can find that file. And we're going to see if we can find that process running. So we use ps-e capital LF, and that will give us threads as well. And we grep for certbot, and we don't see that process running in the process listing, even though it's still in proc and appears to still be running. So now let's go ahead and take a look and see if we can find the environment variable that is setting LD preload. So we can check, env for your current shell to see if it's loaded in your current shell. And then there's a lot of the files, but not an exhaustive list of the places that environment variables can be. And then, of course, check the contents of LD-SO preload. So these are some things that you might want to do first, but I saved it for the end so that we could, kind of go through the process and understand the thoughts behind looking for this type of rootkit. So next is Orbit. So this is an LD preload rootkit, but with a twist. It was discovered by Intezer, does a lot of credential harvesting, file hiding, a lot of stuff that you'd expect from a rootkit. So again, let's give LDD a shot, but nothing there. So let's check process environment variables like we did before. But in this case, we don't see LD preload being loaded into any process environments. We don't find any hidden processes with our script. We check our environment variables and our etc file, and everything looks clean as far as LD preload goes. So let's think back to how LD preload rootkits work. So they affect dynamically linked executables, and any dynamically linked executable will have to use the dynamic linking library. So let's check out the dynamic linking library itself. And so we can take a look and we can see that it was modified somewhat recently, and the timestamps aren't consistent. So that can start to sound some of the alarms in your head. And this is a great file to run integrity monitoring on with expected false positives during patch time, of course. So let's take a look at that file.
Hey, Jace, really quick, if you go back to that last slide, we do have a question. So the question is this specific to Symbiote only, or do most rootkits not intercept system calls from the stat command?
It really depends on the rootkit. They're all written in different ways that try to hide themselves different ways and hide different strings. Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's specific to Symbiote. I think it's a kind of a hallmark of a lot of rootkits, for Linux at least.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so let's take a look at our dynamic linking library. So on a normal system, we can look for the ELF get dynamic info. So we can just use XXD to, kind of get the ASCII for a lot of the hex in that binary. And we'll see that ELF get dynamic info is set to etc LD-SO preload like we would expect. But on this system, abnormally, we see this other directory, libntp vnqe6mk/.l. So that is definitely not normal on any system. So let's try to take a look at that directory, but it won't reveal itself. It's doing its classic hiding behavior, but we can query that .l file directly. So we know that that directory exists. We know that there's file hiding going on. So the .l file is acting as a stand-in for ld.so.preload. So it points to a library that's to be used with preloading. And we can see that libdl.so that it packs itself is what it's looking to load as a intermediary library. But we can't look at that file. The rootkit is set up in such a way that that you can not look at that file. It's scrubbing itself from the output. Let's see, we have a question. Yeah, so identifying what's normal in a system and it's not normal, it can be difficult. It's something that comes with experience, but you can also use other systems that are similar to the one that you're looking at. So if you are looking at a different system and they're kind of giving different results, you can start to kind of get an idea of, why one is acting differently than the other. So we found which dynamic linking library that the Rootkit is now using instead of the typical one, or instead of the typical pointer file for it, but we can't look at that. So this is where BusyBox will come in really nice. It's really nice to use here. Because it's statically linked, we can use the BusyBox version of stat, and we now can see that file. And continued, we can fully see that directory using BusyBox. So ls-lah wouldn't show anything, but the BusyBox statically linked version gives us everything that we want there. So that essentially fully decloaks this directory, and you can take a look at some of these files, the SSH passwords that it was stealing. And so that is pretty much your red flag, your reason to engage incident response and start that whole process. So the kernel module rootkit that we're going to talk about today is Syslog K. It was discovered by AT&T Alien Labs. Does all of the typical file, process, module, network activity hiding. So in the interest of time, we're going to assume that we checked for all of our LD preload artifacts and didn't really find anything. So the next thing that we can look at is kernel modules. So this most simple way to look at them is with lsmod. That will list all kernel modules. And on a clean system versus a suspected system, we can compare those directory listings, and we can see that they're the same in this case. We can compare call sims, which has all of the symbols of all the functions that might have been hooked. And that appears to be the same here as well. Now, on a clean system, we took a look at sys module, and this is the interface for the kernel. So it's the information about the currently running kernel, how it is. And we can see that there's a difference there between a known clean system and a suspected infected system. So we can take a look at what's in there. We can compare both of them. And we see that the difference on the infected system or the suspected infected system is this module called Syslog K. And so this isn't a smoking gun on its own. There could be differences between systems, of course, but we know that when we looked for things in lsmod and etc module, that there was they were both identical up until this point, and that's the suspicious part of this. So one way that Syslog K enhances its stealth is by only executing the malicious background process upon receiving a packet from the attacker. In this case, once you saw the kernel module named Syslog K, you could do research on that and find that Avast has actually released a couple of very useful tools for testing for this rootkit. There's a Python script that will send a packet to your server, and if it's infected, it will start the payload. And so we can use that. We won't necessarily know if it worked because the rootkit is still hiding all of that information, but we can use the Sandfly process decloak, which is specifically made for LKM type rootkits, and we'll see here that it found a suspicious pit there. And so now we have some information that we can, more information that we can go off of. So let's take a look at that proc 1939 that we found with Sandfly process decloak. And we can see this executable coming out of etc, which is very abnormal for any sort of running, long-term running processes. There can be like startup scripts and things like that in there, of course. So let's try to take a look at that directory, but we can't see any directory like that here. But again, we can stat that file directly. So we know that it's there, and we know that it's being hidden. So a lot of the other things that you might try with this, a lot of it can be difficult to understand the results, or it's hard to even trust the results, because when a module is loaded directly into the kernel, there's no telling what extent that it can go to lie to you, essentially. So we want to take a memory dump. So in this case, Lime is a pretty useful tool for Linux in order to get a memory dump that you can look at with volatility. So it usually works by inserting Lime as a kernel module itself and giving it a path to output the memory dump. So then we can, fire up volatility with the correct profile for the system that you're working on, and we can use some of those modules that were mentioned earlier on. Linux hidden modules is one of the really nice ones for that, because it can look for modules that might be outside of the normal memory space, or if there's been attempts to hide it in memory. This plugin is pretty good at finding those kinds of things. So we can see specifically as a hidden module that Syslog K is there. And then we could also, in this case, Syslog K didn't do a lot of effort to hide itself in memory, so you can use the check modules to find it as well. And at this point, if you found something like that, you can use the mod dump utility to just dump out that module, and then it's all there for you to analyze, to check hashes on VirusTotal or what have you. And so Craig Rowland, he's the one that created Sandfly, and he recently tweeted something that I really enjoyed. So this is a different way that you could potentially tell that there's a kernel module being hidden. So in the first case, grep period / etsy modules, a lot of rootkits will operate off of trying to hide from you a string or a set of strings. So when we tried to list / etsy modules and it sees Syslog K in the output, it can then strip that from the results and hide itself. But in doing that, it doesn't necessarily look for like a number of bytes in a row that match that string. So when you use grep period / etsy modules, period represents any character. And so when you're looking in there, you can see the module, like for example Syslog K, you'd be able to see it because it doesn't print out Syslog K, it prints out SYSLOGK, and the module or the rootkit doesn't know that it's looking for that. And you can also do that with DD as well, where you're taking a look at block size of 1, and you're just doing byte by byte, and you can find rootkits that way as well. So that's another useful technique if you're going through those different artifacts that we were looking at. You can basically trick the rootkit into revealing itself. So rootkit removal is a difficult process. The best option, obviously, is to just completely re-image the infected host if possible. Due to the nature of rootkits, it's hard to ever be 100% certain that the malware is removed. In cases where re-imaging the infected host is not possible, for LD preload, you can try clearing out that Etsy file. You can set up integrity checking on that Etsy file, or even just checking to see if that file exists. And that's going to be a red flag in most cases. Checking all of the files that export environment variables to see if there are any there still, or pointing to potentially a different binary that was dropped by the attacker. And then restoring the dynamic linker if that was changed. Another good file to have integrity monitoring on. And for kernel modules, you can try to remove the module with rmmod. In the case of Syslog K, it wouldn't work because it doesn't show up in the listing of modules, but there was a kill switch where if you created a file in proc called Syslog K, just an empty file, then it would decloak the rootkit, and then you'd be able to remove it. That sort of thing is something that you might discover once you were to dump out the module from memory. Then you could fire up whatever analysis tool that you use and potentially find that kill switch. And then removing the module from memory, there's a couple tools that you can use for just carving out a memory space. Terminating hidden processes, whether that's after you decloak the rootkit, you can try to kill those processes and then keep checking for hidden processes afterwards to make sure that you got it. You want to check for your persistence mechanisms on Linux, initd, systemd, cron, rc.d, and then create monitoring alerts for any of those discovered, processes and files, so that if for whatever reason the attacker can get back in and tries to use the same tactics, then you'll know about it immediately. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Eric at this point. I hope you all learned something, and definitely put those questions in the chat there, and I'll be happy to answer any of them.
All right, thank you, Jace. That was really informative and also a great example of the type of research that you and the threat hunting team do on a regular basis. So thank you for that. Just to talk about our service a bit. At Binary Defense, we offer a proactive threat hunting service where our team, Jace and others, develop hypotheses and search through your event data to find attacks that potentially get past your predefined detection rules. Really, what that means is we're trying to answer 3 questions. What security events are analysts not being alerted to today? What gaps exist in your security controls? And what detections can we develop to improve your security posture? Even with the best detection rules in place, things will get through. Threat actors are constantly evolving to evade detection, so our team constantly researches the latest threats and helps us develop useful hypotheses to test and stay ahead of attackers and figure out how to detect what they're doing. Really, at the end of the day, better detections and better understanding equals more effective security. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'll kind of talk through how the service works and how you would engage with us. So it's an annual or a multi-year managed service agreement based on a set number of hunting hours per week. We have standard, advanced, and premium, or 8, 12, and 16 hours per week of threat hunting time that goes to our clients. And really, we can work with clients of any size, any security maturity. So if you have an existing team, an existing threat hunting program in place, that's great. We can augment that, and we can help further that and improve that. And if you're new to threat hunting, we can help you get a program started and set a roadmap to help you improve your maturity. And the key here is that the service leverages data from your existing tech stack. So whatever platforms you're using, we can really work with. Here are the platforms we support from an endpoint and a SIM and logging platform standpoint. So a lot of the main players are in here. You can see we have threat hunters who are well-versed in all these platforms. We can threat hunt in Linux, Mac, or Windows environments. So really, we're pretty flexible with what we can work with and how we can help. So that's a quick overview of how the service works. If you have any interest in learning more about our service and how we can help your team, either shoot me a chat during the webinar or visit our website and request more information there, and we'll get you in touch with the right teams. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And with that, let's turn it over to Q&A. So, Jace, I do have 2 questions here for you. The first one is, as a threat hunter, how do you develop hypotheses and decide what to look for or what to test?
So a lot of it, I'd say there's kind of 2 sides of the coin for what we do. And I'd say one side is keeping on top of the latest trends. So seeing what attackers are doing, and that will, come with reading all of the most recent news that comes out. You can start to see some of the trends that attackers use to, accomplish a lot of the things that they do. And then I'd say the other side of the coin is just behavioral. Like when you start looking into these things that attackers are doing, a lot of the times it will branch off into, well, if they're doing that and that's weird, then this other thing is also possible and that's weird. And so we learn a lot from our research and just kind of our intuition and the things that we've learned in security and IT, and a lot of that will just naturally kind of start coming to us, and that's kind of how we go about our hunting.
Cool. And then the last question I have here right now is, what happens if you do find an active threat or find that a client has already been breached? What's the process there? What happens?
If we find that we have evidence of a breach, we immediately will bring that to the attention of our clients while we continue to research the threat, find any information that we can about it, while the client decides whether it's a serious threat. We'll advise them the entire way, and then potentially engage incident response, in which case we can provide any information and hand off the case effectively so that there's no information loss.
Awesome. Those are the only 2 questions that I have here now. If anyone has any more, please feel free to ask. But barring that, thanks everybody for attending. I hope you found the content useful. As I said in the chat, we will be sending out the deck after the webinar. You'll probably get that tomorrow morning. So you can feel free to look through and read the notes. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Jace or myself, and we'll connect you with the right team to make sure we get your questions answered. Thank you, everybody.
See someone raise their hand.
Oh, yep, I do see that. Yeah, Michael, do you have any question, anything you want to say? Maybe not. Okay, I guess not. Well, thanks everybody for the time today, and have a good rest of the afternoon.
See ya. Thanks for coming.
Yep, bye-bye.